at SendTomCotton on Twitter. Senator, great to have you back on the broadcast.
Good morning, Alex. It's good to be back on with you. I hope you and all your listeners enjoyed a restful and happy Independence Day weekend.
I did, and thank you, Senator. Same to you. And let's start there. It was very stark difference in messaging throughout America, which is very divided right now. At least that is the perception anyone who follows the media will get. I thought the president and some of the Republicans gave more soaring messages about America's history and the brilliance and greatness that it inspired. And the left, including and perhaps especially the Democrat standard bearer right now, Joe Biden, told the story of America that did not have any virtue whatsoever. It was basically just naturally a very racist place and a terrible place. And we should be erasing our history as quickly as we can dismantle it. Your reaction to that stark contrast?
Well, that was a stark contrast, Alex. That was on display. The president's speeches at Mount Rushmore Friday night, the White House on Saturday. If you had only read the account of those speeches in major newspapers and seen it on CNN, you would have thought that he was declaring civil war on his opponents. When in fact, if you listen to those speeches, they were two of his best since his speech in Warsaw a couple of years ago, celebrating the American story and the struggle that we've always mounted to try to live up to our founding creed that all men are created equal. They were inspiring and compelling speeches that recognizes while people are imperfect, principles are not. And the principle that is at the heart of the American experiment is that fact that we're all created equal in the eyes of God, and that no nation on earth in the history of mankind has done more to uphold the dignity and the equality of every person in the United States.
Yeah, and I think this is interesting. What are the seminal moments in American history that a politician or a leader would want to highlight in a moment like this? And I played Governor Noem's excellent speech from South Dakota when she was introducing the president, and she gave this incredible quote from Teddy Roosevelt about American character. And you look at what the president chose to highlight with George Washington's incredible history and legacy, as well as all the others who were featured on Mount Rushmore. And then you contrast that, not to mention his speech on July 4th itself, which was a lot of it was about our military victories and our prowess in keeping the world safe, and not to mentioning all of these great Americans who will be featured in the new National Garden Memorial. And then you contrast that with Joe Biden's 90-second Twitter video, which I'm sure you saw because it's so short, because that's all Biden's up for, I guess, these days. He defines America by Bull Connor and the assassination of Martin Luther King and the killing of George Floyd and slavery and unequal treatment of women, as if America is a uniquely terrible place. And I feel like that is such a profound thing to talk about on Independence Day.
Yeah, the contrast couldn't be starker between the president's speeches and Vice President Biden's short Twitter video, which, as you say, is probably about as much as he's capable of speaking these days. Obviously, America is imperfect because we're made up of humans, and all human beings are imperfect. But the principle at the heart of our country, that we are all created equal in the eyes of God, and we've always done more to live up to that principle than any other nation, could not be more perfect. And on Independence Day, we ought to be celebrating the patriots of '76, who, like all of us, had their imperfections, but who did more for the cause of human liberty and more for this nation than anyone in the world up to that point. And we ought to be celebrating those giants that we see at places like Mount Rushmore and the giant monuments and memorials we see in on our National Mall.
You know, so one thing that I've been, as a segue back into the news with you, Senator Tom Cotton, the one thing that I've been pointing out is that we are in this moment of where we're being hypercritical of Americans from 200 odd years ago for their treatment of Black Americans and to a lesser extent women. But we are not at all focused on the way we are dealing with the single most oppressive regime on the planet right now, which is communist China, which is trying to colonize Africa, has actual concentration camps. It does discriminate openly against Black people. And we have embraced them in many ways, and we are not being critical enough of their behavior at this moment when they have unleashed a pandemic on the planet. You've been the most hawkish on China, and to your credit, in my view, update us on where we are at with China, the Wuhan virus, et cetera, and where the Senate's thinking is on this moment.
The Chinese Communist Party is an evil regime. As you say, they are running concentration camps in northwestern China. They are persecuting Christians throughout their region. They have long forced abortions on women or sterilization on women. Yet many of the woke champions of the left in America, like so many NBA players led by LeBron James, want to turn a blind eye to their crimes. At the same time, they denounce our own police officers, which I think is a disgraceful and shameful contrast. And that's just the inherent character of the regime in China, Alex, to say nothing of the threats that they pose to us, unleashing a pandemic on the world through, first, it would seem negligence, but then malevolence that is so characteristic of the Chinese Communist Party, or taking our jobs, taking our factories for decades while too many politicians in Washington stood by. Look just around the periphery of what they've done in the last few weeks. They have broken their fundamental obligations to Hong Kong. When they received over Hong Kong from Great Britain, they promised to preserve its unique character for years. 3 years later, that's gone. They've, in essence, invaded India, the world's largest democracy, killing 20 Indian soldiers in a brutal attack. They're conducting threatening air and naval maneuvers in the vicinity of Taiwan and Japan. China is only growing more aggressive, partly using this pandemic for cover. That's one reason why it's so important that we've finally begun to stand up to China under President Trump.
And so how would you further that right now? What do you think should be, how should we advance our China policy at the moment?
Alex, there's so many things we could do. Just take, for instance, the fact that we now have two carrier strike groups in the South China Sea as China is conducting naval exercises there to demonstrate our resolve. Legislation that we could consider later this month to amend the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act to allow American citizens to hold Chinese officials accountable inside in American courts, to bring back critical supply chains, whether it's semiconductors, legislation that is about to pass the Senate that I wrote with John Cornyn and several other senators, as well as legislation that I hope to pass that will bring back critical supply chains and pharmaceuticals and medical goods and medical equipment.
It's crucial.
Those are just a few of the ways that we need to begin to check China's ambitions and ensure that they understand that we will never allow them to replace the United States as the world's strongest economic and military power.
So I live in Northern Virginia where we have mask mandates, and I only own the super cheap paper China masks, and I find that incredibly ironic that I'm forced to wear a mask from China while I go into stores in order to operate, have a functional life. Let's look at I want to contrast China, which is obviously, in my view, the greatest geopolitical threat. I think you agree with what the media perceives as the greatest geopolitical threat, which is Russia. And they have another narrative out there where Russia is controlling Trump. And in fact, that Russia is plotting to assassinate Americans and Trump is letting them do it. That's essentially what the New York Times reported based off of anonymous sources, as is often the case. What's going on here with this story and your thoughts?
Yeah, well, Alex, it's not just the media, it's the Democrats too. I guess you call the media is the media wing of the Democratic Party that is now acting like the Cold Warriors they never were during the actual Cold War. Remember, it was only 8 years ago when Mitt Romney called Russia our greatest geopolitical threat. And if you recall that Barack Obama mocked him for that, saying the 1980s called and they wanted their foreign policy back.
That's right.
But now the Democrats and the media want to act like Russia is 10 feet tall. Russia is not 10 feet tall. Russia is a declining power. It has a GDP that's only two-thirds the size of Italy, which is not exactly a powerhouse these days. Now, that doesn't mean that Russia is not a genuine threat to the United States and our interests. If you look at their nuclear forces or their intelligence capabilities, the fact that they're constantly meddling in our allies in Europe or trying to undermine the interests of our partners in the Middle East. So it's important that President Trump has drawn firm lines on Russia's conduct, sending anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, for instance, where President Obama would only send blankets, or trying to stop a pipeline that would connect Germany directly into Russian oil and gas that would undermine our NATO allies in Eastern Europe, sanctioning Russian officials, closing down Russian consulates in the United States that were being used as spy outposts. These are things that Barack Obama refused to do for 8 years. So the Democrats and the immediate wing can get all chesty about taking on Russia, but they didn't do it when Barack Obama was in office. And now they oppose a lot of what President Trump has done, canceling obsolete Cold War era treaties, for instance, or expanding our nuclear forces. So most of that is just political show to try to undermine the president politically. It's not about actually protecting America's interests.
Yeah, you're right on this. And I was just for a project outside the show, I was just going through how tough the president's been on Russia relative to President Obama, and it's just night and day. I'll bring that out when we have some more time. In the meantime, you've got the World Health Organization quietly admitting that China and their Communist Party never reported on the coronavirus outbreak, or at least held back crucial details. This is something that I think you and I would have assumed was the case. And yet, again, the Democrats and the media wing of the Democratic Party really does not want to talk about this. They want to talk only about the president and when it comes to coronavirus.
Well, this story shows how corrupt the Chinese Communist Party is. It also shows how corrupt the World Health Organization is. We now know that Beijing did not report the outbreak of the Wuhan coronavirus to the WHO belatedly, albeit. But in fact, the WHO's China office simply got public reports in the media or from local health authorities in China, and only then did they begin to try to figure out what was going on. So if Beijing had had its way, we might never have known about this coronavirus originating in Wuhan until it had spread all across the country and perhaps all around the world. Yet WHO covered for Beijing's duplicity for months and months and months. That's one reason the president has withdrawn from the WHO, and I think rightly so.
I agree with you on that. Senator Tom Cotton, again, Republican, Arkansas. Two more questions for you today. A House committee at least has advanced a bill to rename military bases. The president said that he is going to veto any defense bill if it renames U.S. bases named for Confederate figures. I'm actually with the president on this. I have no allegiance to the South or the Confederacy in general. I just hate this slippery slope that we're on. But, Senator, I want your perspective.
Well, the Senate's considering a similar bill, Alex, and I want to highlight just how radical that legislation is from Elizabeth Warren. It may be portrayed in the media as Confederate-named bases. It is far more radical, far more extreme. It would require a crane to go into Arlington National Cemetery and tear out the memorial to war dead. It would do the same thing at cemeteries all around the country. It would shut down exhibits in military museums of the Civil War. It would require the removal of paintings from the walls of West Point depicting Civil War battle scenes or West Point superintendents. That's how sweeping and radical this proposal is. It's not something I can support. I've offered legislation that would put a commission in place to study the scope of the issue, to make a decision in a deliberate, thoughtful, considered fashion on a sound evidentiary basis, not have these Jacobin mobs tearing down statues, ripping paintings off the wall, and destroying memorials of war dead in our military cemeteries.
It's so well said, and that's the way to do it. You do this in a methodical approach. You don't do it in a woke panic, but that's what we feel like. We can't just stand there or think or debate or reason with one another. We have to do whatever we can so that we can virtue signal during this woke panic moment we're in. It's just my take on it, Senator. Last one for today. The president said the U.S. monument destroyers will get at least 10 years in prison. This is another one where you've really been a leader, not just China, but on bringing the Republican Party and the conservative movement back to being the voice of law and order. You've been pushing this for a couple months. It seems like people are catching up to you in this regard. Give me your thoughts, either big picture or on the president's 10-year prison plan.
Yeah, that's a law that passed in 2003 called the Veteran Memorials Preservation Act, which gives 10 years in prison to anyone who destroys or otherwise harms a statue commemorating someone's military service. Take the statue of Andrew Jackson in Lafayette Square. There couldn't be a more open and cut case that the law was violated and that those perpetrators deserve 10 years in prison. There's other federal laws that could be used as well for other kinds of statue in certain circumstances. What needs to happen, though, is that local authorities need to first defend property, public and private, and to those who would deface or otherwise destroy property, they need to hold them accountable under local laws. That's how you'll stop this mob violence. And then if cities and states want to have debates about who they honor and how they honor them, that is fine to do so in an orderly process in front of the people's elected representatives, but we can never give it to the mob.
Absolutely right. Senator Tom Cotton, really appreciate it. Come back soon.
Thank you.